Hi, I'm John Nunn, and in this video I'm going to talk about one of my own books, Understanding Chess Middlegames. This was published back in 2011 and has been selling well ever since. As an author, when you finish a book, you sometimes think, I wish I'd done this or that slightly differently, it might have produced a better book. But in this case, I think I can say that I'm very happy with the results, and when I finished the book, I was pleased with the end product. The book is a general guide to the middle game. It's divided into several sections. There's a section on material imbalances, attacking play, defensive play, strategic matters, and one of my favourite sections are typical mistakes. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of the book is that it's divided into 100 sections. And each section has a double page spread. So normally there are 2 positions or games on each of the 100 topics on the 2 facing pages. Now, one issue as a publisher is that you want to produce electronic versions of books you're printing, and there are Kindle and app versions of this book available. But when you have a highly structured layout in the print version, it sometimes doesn't translate particularly well to the electronic versions. Since the e-books have to be displayed on screens of different sizes, and the user can, generally speaking, change the size of the text, for example, you can't have a structure which is based on a page-by-page basis as the print book is. So while the electronic versions obviously have a huge advantage, if you're going away to play in a tournament, it's much easier to take the electronic versions than a huge stack of print books as one used to do in the old days. But in certain cases there is a little loss in using the electronic rather than the print versions. But that can't be helped. There are advantages and disadvantages to each format. Well, what I want to do is to show you one of the games from the book, and I'm just going to scroll through the contents. So strategy, activity, attacking play, defensive play, pawn structure, typical central pawn formations, and, as I say, typical mistakes. So I'm going to go to the section underestimating an attack. And there are two games here. Let's take a look at the one I want to show you. One of the things you learn in chess fairly early on is that an unjustified attack is unlikely to work. We all learn the teachings of Steinitz back in the late 19th century, that an attack which doesn't have a good positional foundation is probably going to fail. And this becomes so ingrained into one's chess psyche that it's quite easy to underestimate a crude looking attack. But such attacks can be dangerous if they're conducted skillfully, and they're not doomed to fail no matter what you do. You have to respond accurately. So let's see an example of that in this game. Hamducci against Zigalko. It's a Sicilian defence, open Sicilian, Najdorf variation met by bishop c4, very popular with Bobby Fischer in the old days. And natural development. Okay, sometimes white doesn't put the rook on e1 in this and instead prefers to leave the rook on f1 and play f4. But we'll see that Hamducci has a particular idea in mind. Bishop drops back before it's attacked. Okay, well you might say this has all been completely normal and standard up to now. But at this point, white played rook e3. It's an odd looking move. The idea is evidently to play rook g3 and start an attack. But the preconditions for this attack don't really seem to be there. There's no weakness on black's king side. His structure looks perfectly sound. White still has a number of pieces on the queen side which haven't yet moved. And the centre is in no way blocked, so there's the possibility for black to inaugurate counterplay in that sector of the board. So it would be easy to just dismiss this as the sort of thing that a beginner might do, and a few natural moves will expose the premature attack for what it is. But of course, Hamducci is not a bad player at all. He's a dangerous player, and so black should have been a little bit more careful about how this rather direct attacking plan was met. There's nothing wrong with simple development like this, and now the rook came to g3. Well, one of the risks for white in playing like this is that if the attack fails, white has spent 2 tempi putting his rook in a position where it actually isn't doing very much. So there's a potential for a considerable loss of time. But the rook is, of course, quite well placed for an attack on g3, and one idea is obviously to develop the bishop to h6, attacking the pawn on g7. If the pawn moves, then the rook behind it will be hanging. Well, in fact, black already made a slight inaccuracy here, allowing white to do something with a tactical point. The simplest counter to white's plan is probably just to play king h8, which nullifies the threat of bishop h6 and removes the king from the same file as the white rook. In that case, white would have had much more difficulty in justifying his play. But instead, black decided to exchange knights. But now, white did not recapture. White played bishop h6. It's an important intermediary move because it in fact develops the bishop with gain of tempo. The tactical justification behind this is that if black moves the knight, for example to take the bishop, then white plays bishop takes g7, threatening indeed mate in 1, and it's a mating threat which in fact cannot be met. So black cannot do anything to rescue his knight on g4 after white's bishop h6. In fact, to avoid losing the exchange after g6 bishop takes f8, there's only one possibility, and that's to drop the knight back to e8 to defend the attack pawn on g7. But we can see already the results of the inaccuracy of taking on d4 instead of playing king h8 is white has gained a twofold advantage. He has developed his bishop with gain of tempo, and he has forced black to retreat his well-placed knight to the first rank, where it is not at all active. Well, now indeed white took back on d4, regaining the piece and threatening mate on g7, so the reply was practically forced, and the queen drops back. But now, although black has met the immediate threat to g7, he has been forced to place his pieces on rather uncomfortable squares. The knight on e8 has no real scope, and although the bishop on f6 is not badly placed, the pawn on d6 is another reason why black can't move the knight on e8. Also, you notice that white has got his bishop into play, and the rook can come into play as well, and then white has developed all his pieces. So what initially seemed like a rather slow plan has, thanks to black's inaccuracy, allowed white to accelerate his development. Well, black developed his rook, which is perfectly reasonable, and white brought his final piece into play. Well, the position is still, pretty balanced. Perhaps white has a slight advantage here, but there's nothing too terrible likely to happen unless black commits a further mistake, which is actually what happened. Black should have just been content to leave the situation on the king side as it is and improve the position of his pieces. For example, he could have played b5 here, with the possibility of dislodging the knight with b4, or he could have played perhaps bishop c6 so as to exert some pressure on the e4 pawn. It would be rather greedy to win it with bishop takes c3 and bishop takes e4, but maybe if black plays king h8 and forces the bishop to retreat, then winning the pawn on e4 is not such a ridiculous possibility. But instead, black made a a mistake here. He aimed to shatter white's queenside pawn structure, but in doing so he gave up one of his main defensive pieces. He played here bishop e5, attacking the rook and practically forcing the reply f4, and then he took on c3. White, of course, cannot take back with the rook because the bishop on h6 would then be hanging, so he's forced to take back with a pawn, leaving him with doubled isolated pawns on the queen side. So there's been an exchange of advantages here. Black has given up the active bishop on f6, which was Black's best placed minor piece, and in return he shattered the queenside pawns. But the damage to White's queenside pawns is only relevant if Black can survive the kingside attack, and the lack of the defensive bishop means that he's probably in more danger now than hitherto. Well, Black made a really serious mistake for a player rated 2600, and I feel that being flustered by the unexpected strength of White's primitive looking attack lulled him into a frame of mind which led to the serious mistake he now makes. Black wants to expel the bishop from h6, and at various earlier stages he could have done this by playing king h8, but he does it now at the absolute worst possible moment. Well, what Black should have played was queen b6 check, and then after king h1, f5. It looks like a horribly risky move to play because it weakens the diagonal from b3 to g8, but actually there's no immediate way for White to exploit this, and the move of the f-pawn gives Black's rook scope to, for example, go to f6 to expel the bishop, or to go to f7 to support the vulnerable g7 square. Of course, it requires a lot of courage to play a move like f5, but in this case it would have been justified. Well, he made this really serious mistake, playing the right move at the wrong moment, and now White struck with this neat queen sacrifice. If Black takes the queen, then it's mate in two, like this, and the queen on d6 threatens mate in 1 on f8, but also threatens the bishop on d7. So not only has White won a pawn, but he also has various dangerous threats. Well, the only way Black can avoid losing a piece here is to play rook g8, and after the subsequent moves, 4 series of exchanges here, we have a position in which White has an extra pawn, and additionally he has an active rook on the 7th rank attacking 2 enemy pawns. It should be an easy win. In fact, White now rather messed up and slightly spoilt the game. He could have just taken the pawn on f7, which would have been a simple and effective way to gain a little bit more extra material, but instead he played e5, and although it's still winning, it's perhaps a little bit more tricky now. Black took the opportunity to get his rook on the 2nd rank. White is not able to exploit the pin knight immediately because bishop a4 is met by b5. So although White's still a pawn up with an active rook, he's got 2 sets of double pawns now, which makes it a little bit more difficult to exploit the material. Should still be winning, however. Black unpins the knight, pawn goes up, and now Black gets his knight out finally from the bad square on e8 where it's been stuck for such a long time. White uses his pawn to deny the Black knight any possibility of further activity. Black now tries to get his knight to a6 to attack the pawn on c5. Well, and now White should have played c6, takes rook d6, regaining the pawn and well, getting rid of the, effectively exchanging the rather sick pawn on c5 for the healthy pawn on b7, and then again White would be a pawn up with an active rook with what should be a technical win. Instead, White played rook d6, and Black now got his knight to a good square. Black actually had the possibility to get some drawing chances here, by swapping pieces and going into a rook ending. The upshot of this would have been a rook and pawn ending with 4 pawns each on the king side and white having an extra c pawn. It might be winning, but then again, rook and pawn endings with an extra pawn are notoriously difficult to win, and in fact many are drawn. So this would have been a fair drawing chance, which black was actually quite lucky to get. But instead he made another tactical oversight. He took the bishop on b3, overlooking the very strong reply rook d7. Black now can't exchange rooks because the d pawn will promote, nor can he defend the rook with his king because white swaps rooks and takes on b7. So black is obliged to play rook to e8, and now the pawn goes forward, threatening rook d8, promoting the pawn. So black's forced to go rook c8, and now white recaptures the knight on b3. In a way, this kind of delayed recapture is an echo of what happened with the knight exchange on d4 at an earlier stage of the game. And now the position is quite lost for black. White has a pass pawn in the 7th rank. Black cannot bring his king to f8 because of rook d8 check. So there's nothing black can do to prevent white from marching his king in and winning the black rook for the c pawn. So that was a really interesting game. Nice tactics by white, making the most of his attacking chances, but it's also an example of how it's possible to underestimate an attack which looks unjustified. The attack may well in fact be unjustified, but accurate and correct defensive play may be needed to demonstrate that fact, and a couple of casual moves can turn an unjustified attack into one which is fully justified. Well, that gives you a sample of, that is one of the 2 positions from this one of the sections of the 100 in the book. So I think it's a nice book. I'm very happy with it, and yeah, I hope that a lot of people have found it useful. Okay, thanks for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you for the next one.